Hello, I'm Ellen Troxclair, and I'm so grateful that you're joining us today for a panel with Kevin Roberts, the Executive Director of the Texas Public Policy Foundation, talking about America. Are we made to endure? Why are we better or bigger than any election? It seems like in this day and age of divisiveness and constant news coverage and back and forth, you worry about what this election is really going to mean for our country. We always hear that this is the most critical election in history, but it seems like this time it really might be. But in order to get a bigger picture of why our country is made to endure elections, regardless of the leaders that are elected, Kevin Roberts is going to provide us with some perspective. He earned a Ph.D. from the University of Texas in history, and then went on to serve as a history professor and ultimately started his own K through 12 school. He was hired at the Wyoming Catholic College, and of course has since then been hired as the executive director and leader of the Texas Public Policy Foundation. The Texas Public Policy Foundation is the largest state-based think tank in the country and has absolutely been leading the way in this country and in the state through this pandemic and this crisis. And he's going to tell us why things are always going to be brighter on the other side as long as we're in America. Kevin, thanks so much for being with us today.
Ellen, thanks so much for doing this. It's great to be a friend of yours, a colleague of yours. You do some great work here in Austin and beyond. And so thanks for stepping in and being the host of the TPPF Monday live stream. After last week, people said, Kevin, y'all did a really good job of analyzing the election and giving us a forecast, but we're a little pessimistic about that realism. And I understand that, as a think tank, and you appreciate this because you do so much good work with us. Sometimes when you tell the truth and the truth isn't as pretty as we would like, people are looking for a little optimism. So I figured with your great optimism and good cheer and hopefully some joyfulness and optimism that I can offer, we'd have a good conversation.
Well, good. I think that you're tapping into almost my own feelings. When I got the invitation to host this today, I thought, oh my gosh, that's exactly what I need. And, of course, after serving on the Austin City Council, it was a constant struggle to maintain optimism in that role, and going into an election for other Austin City Council members and giant bonds, giant property tax increases that we have on the ballot. It is easy to go down that path. So let's start out here with talking about this upcoming election. Of course, you have a keen interest in policy as the director of TPPF, but how does your background and experience as a historian influence and really help to provide you grounding for your perspective?
In a lot of ways, that's the question I've been thinking about the last few weeks. That is that, of course, this election is important. Every election is important. If we as a self-governing people ever stop thinking that any election is important, then we really are going to run into some problems. But the point is, as a historian, I realized that while there is a lot riding on this election, particularly as it regards federal policy and even some very basic definitions like definition of what it means to be patriotic, that regardless of who wins the presidency, regardless of which political party ends up controlling the US Senate, that the next day, the sun is very, very, very likely to rise in the East and very, very, very likely to set in the West. And I say that not to be overly sarcastic, but just as some perspective. And so as a historian, and having been trained just up the street in the history of the United States and of the early United States, I guess I have a perspective that we've done this many times in our history. There have been many hotly contested elections in the United States. In fact, as I was thinking of examples, Ellen, I thought about the election of 1796 and then 1800 between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. There were charges that each candidate made about the other that I'd be embarrassed to repeat in polite company. I mean, it really was that bad. We've had elections, as I'm sure we'll talk about, that were contested for weeks and a couple of months. And because I happen to think, as we mentioned last week, that we may not know the winner of the presidential election for at least a few weeks, I think we have to have a bigger perspective. Those of us with faith know that, of course, we're going to win in the end. In other words, as I like to say, we're supernaturally optimistic, which just puts a smile on our faces. But even for people tuning in who aren't necessarily religious or spiritual, I think we ought to have a faith in this country. And that's the point that I want to make, that perhaps what we're being called to do is not just participate and to vote and even to be vocal, but to make sure that when the election concludes, that we go about our lives in ways that are befitting good neighbors, even if we happen to vote differently.
Right. Yeah. And you bringing up the election around the 1800 turn of the century. I mean, for those of us who have seen Hamilton and kind of read about that election, and Hamilton's become so big in popular culture, it was a good reminder that at least we're not dueling anymore, right?
Yeah, I'm glad we're not dueling anymore, for those of us who would rely on shotguns to be a good shot. But I love the cultural revitalization of early America through the play Hamilton. I have some historian friends, the typical fuddy-duddy historians, just say, oh, it's just terrible that we have to resort to drama to be able to tell history. And I think the exact opposite. I think it's good. And I saw in fact, we have evidence of this, huge spike in interest in early America, in Hamilton. And that really sort of underscores one of the main points I would make when I'm asked the question, why are you going to be optimistic even if your side doesn't win the election? And that's because what we have inherited as Americans, regardless of where we live, what party we belong to, what church we go to, is so great. It is so profound that even if our guy or gal loses the election we care about, we ought to wake up the next day just as optimistic about this country.
Well, tell us how, we've talked a little bit about the uncertainty of this election and how we very well may not know the results for a few days, possibly even weeks, just because of the kind of complications that the pandemic has led us to change with the vote in mail-in ballots and dropping off ballots and expected legal contests and all these things. So how is our system, how should we be optimistic about that? Because when I think about that, I mean, causes a little bit of a panic for me. And of course, our current president will continue to be president until the next president is sworn in January. So it's not that we're without a leader, but certainly it causes a little bit of uneasiness for those of us who want to know what is going to happen. How is our system built to manage and navigate that uncertainty?
Well, I'll give you a two-part answer. The first part is really brief, and then if you don't mind, I'll give a little bit of an extended answer in terms of detail. And the point of the detail, Ellen, from my vantage point as a historian of the Constitution, is to provide some solace in those weeks, as I expect it will be the case starting a week from tomorrow, of not knowing ultimately who's going to win the presidency. So the short answer is the Constitution and the system of election rules and laws are very clear about how and when we determine the outcome. Of course, as people know, if they tune into this every week, I'm also convinced that there's going to be some percentage of voting fraud. And that burns me up as an American. And I'm not being dismissive of that when I say the system will still largely take care of most of that. The extended answer is that the Constitution is extremely clear. It could not be clearer about when ultimately the election has to be determined. So we all know that next Tuesday, November 3rd, the remaining voters will go to the polls and vote. I say that because we've had 60 million people vote already via mail or early voting. And what I would predict, just sort of moving day by day, is that when we turn on the televisions on Tuesday night, 8 days from now, that people who are right of center, people who are conservatives, people, frankly, who voted for Donald Trump are going to be very happy. They're going to see, this is a prediction from a historian, just as a historian, not a partisan comment, that Donald Trump will appear to have won re-election. The problem, as we've outlined, is that over the remaining hours of November 3rd and the wee hours of November 4th, we're going to see the full scale of those early votes and the mail-in ballots. And as a result, the television networks are going to be in a position of not being able to call a winner. And former Vice President Biden is going to be in a position of being very hopeful that he has gained a large enough majority of those mail-in and early votes that over the subsequent days and perhaps weeks, he's going to be able to overtake the president's lead. And then we have the swing of swing states, Pennsylvania, which I happen to believe, based on intel and data that we've seen, is truly too close to call. They will be counting ballots there, Ellen, several days after November 3rd.
Wow.
And as a result, there will be, even in places where the vote seems to be clear, a grave difficulty in declaring a winner. And so I think that we will all be sitting around eating Thanksgiving dinner. And by the way, I would encourage us to do that with as many people in our homes and other places that you want to do so. If you feel better being outside, then do it. Be Americans is what I'm trying to say. The point is, the Constitution requires that the vote be certified in early December. In fact, the vote has to be turned over on December 14th. That's when our electors gather in each of our state capitals and cast their vote. 6 days prior, they have to turn in their votes. And so what I'm saying is, even if in the worst case scenario, we don't know the winner, there will be a winner declared to this election in December. And there have been 4 or 5, in some cases, you might even say 6 elections like that in the United States. And guess what? We're still here today.
Really? 4, 5, or 6 elections? Like, okay, that's surprising. I did not know that. See, there's,
Yes.
yeah, I love the perspective that you bring to this.
Well, and that's just it. People say, Kevin, why are you a little more optimistic than most people I hear? I say, well, we've got 230 years of taking people who, because they're humans, are not perfect, working in an imperfect system and still having a result that at least is clear. Now, I'm not suggesting that 100% of people who voted will be happy, right? But that gets into their own ideological and partisan leanings, which I'm sure we'll talk about. But the point is that the system and the Constitution are very clear. We have had for example, the election of 1824. There was no clear winner in the Electoral College, and so that went to the House of Representatives. Well, that would be messy to begin with, but it's even messier when you think about each state delegation having just one vote. And so if that happens, and let me tell you, if you are doing like I am, going to realclearpolitics.com and playing with the Electoral College map, there are a couple of truly viable scenarios where President Trump gets 269 electoral votes and Joe Biden gets 269 electoral votes. That's the scenario one scenario that sends the election into the House of Representatives. And so then you say, well, gosh, I know who the winner is going to be. It'll be the Democrat Joe Biden, because Nancy Pelosi is a Democrat, and the Democrats have a very clear majority in the House. Not so fast. Each state delegation gets one vote. 26 of the 50 state delegations are majority Republican. You can predict exactly how this will go. And very narrowly in that scenario, I would predict, in fact, TPPF has predicted in a recent kind of game planning or wargaming scenario we did, that the president would win re-election. So I'm not suggesting that it will necessarily be fun if we go through that situation. But what I am saying is that there will be a winner elected. And because that has happened before in 1824, also very similar circumstances in 1876, more recently, although a different scenario, there were great questions about fraud in 1960. In fact, we know that fraud happened, perhaps even tipping the election in favor of John Kennedy. This country will survive. Of course, whoever wins is going to have an influence over policy that half the country will not like. That's really where the rubber meets the road when it comes to 2021 and beyond.
Right. Well, it's, hearing you talk, it's almost like we're zooming out, right? To get that bigger picture. And we get so busy and invested in our own daily lives, in our own bubble. And it's easy to forget the perspective that history provides us. I've heard a lot of how, 2020 is just going to go down in history as the worst year ever, between COVID and schools being closed and social distancing and people being, or elderly parents being isolated from their loved ones, and police and civil unrest. And it's just, I mean, it does seem like this year has just been such a beatdown, and adding a very divisive presidential election on top of that is certainly unhelpful. But then I saw, that and I'm going to forget the year. See, I'm not a good historian.
That's
like
fine.
you.
This is not a quiz, Ellen.
But then I saw that, a few hundred years ago or so, the actual, historically decided worst year in the history of the world, there was a 2-year dust storm that caused darkness over, the entire population, and you really couldn't go outside because you couldn't breathe. And I mean so it's like, okay, we can deal with some, not optimal political debates, and I don't know. I think the stay-at-home and the working moms who have had to deal with everything going on in their lives, on top of trying to now become homeschool experts and all of that, have certainly had the worst during this year. But it really did give me, okay, well, at least we're not in darkness for 2 years, because that would truly be the worst year ever.
Yeah, especially for Americans, right? And what a wonderful question. I'll mention a couple of things, but I might respond initially by saying, to whom much is given, much is asked, right? And so I would suggest to our fellow Americans that we've been given challenges this year that are in fact historically significant, and I'll come back to that. But I will say that if you think about being in Eastern Europe in 1914 or the late 1930s, or if you were someone not real keen about Joseph Stalin's leadership in the Soviet Union in the 1950s, that perhaps what we've endured in 2020, it has a little bit of perspective to it. I'm not going to be dismissive of it, even obviously for people who have had COVID problems in their families, seen loved ones die and be sick. That's obvious. But the rest of us, I would say, as you and I have discussed, Ellen, also have endured COVID because of overreach by government. I think that actually is going to be more historically significant than even the disease itself. Right. But let me just speak about the historical significance of this year. I used to do what I called a mini lecture in American history, which I will not replicate in full now, where I would go through what I call the hat rungs of American history, that if each of those hat rungs was a year that you might say is a turning point in American history, or one at which at least something changed, I actually would put 2020 right there. I mean, I'm violating one of the rules of historians, which is that you need to complete an event before assessing its historicity. We haven't even seen what happens in the presidential election, and it's only October. But I would say that while 2020 certainly pales in comparison to 1776, the date of the Declaration, to 1789, the ratification of the Constitution, or 1865, when the Civil War concluded, I would say certainly in the 20th and 21st centuries, especially for those of us who've seen the trajectory of government power increase since the New Deal, and especially in the last 30 years, that 2020 has continued that. And I would say, unfortunately, that is not a partisan or biased comment. That's something that has happened in both red and blue states. And I think for us as a free, self-governing people, regardless of who wins the election next week, or during election month, as one of our guests said last week, that we have to get about the business of reclaiming for ourselves, whether Republicans, Democrats, Libertarians, Green, whatever else, that self-governance. And I think that we can be optimistic about the country's surviving election and even surviving 2020, while recognizing that we really do need to put our focus properly, not on the election, but on what we do about that. And even about that, even on that, I'm cautiously optimistic.
Okay. Yeah, that's helpful. Well, talk to me about, you said even no matter, regardless of what happens in the election, we need to focus on being good citizens and being kind to each other, and interacting in a way that is deserving of living in a country as great as America is. And that is, hits especially close to home for me personally for a variety of reasons. But I would say, first of all, just after coming out of, months and months of, relative isolation, and also being at home working, but also raising a 4-year-old, a 2-year-old, and a 1-year-old baby, and seeing them kind of experience this election and this year for the first time. Of course, I don't want to incite panic in them. I want to teach them to be good citizens. I'm constantly, teaching them to be kind to one another and above all else. And, you look at our preschools or our grade schools, and it's like, those kids aren't caught up in everything that we are, right? They still understand the importance of sitting down to dinner as a family and talking about our days, and having friends and neighbors over, even that we don't even know their political, unless they have a sign in the yard. We're not talking about politics generally when we're inviting them over to dinner, or when my daughter is having a play date. We're enjoying each other's company. We're playing, but I know that's gotten harder and harder during this time, at a time when we need that social interaction in order to help us keep those ties to one another as humans. So tell us kind of just your perspective or your practical tips on how we continue that, how we continue to be good, just members of our society and good people, regardless of what happens in the election.
Gosh, I love that question, Ellen, because it focuses on the practical. And I think one of the things that our foundation does well, even amid our kind of heady think tank work, is reminding our audience, but also starting with ourselves as models of behavior, what to do practically as, as solutions to the problems we're talking about. And so what you're saying there about having dinner at home is part of it. Knowing our neighbors is part of it. And so over the last 6 or 7 months during COVID tide, I've encouraged people to the extent that they feel comfortable getting out and introducing themselves to a neighbor that they've not yet met. And you're right. I mean, that's a little bit harder when we have competing political signs in our front yards, because some people want to throw up a wall there. But I think for those of us, and speak for you and me, I know we're right of center. I would call myself a conservative, and unabashedly so. Those of us who are conservatives ought to take the lead in befriending people who, either through the yard signs that they have or through comments they make on social media or when we encounter them, have a different thought. And the reason I say that is that I think one of the great conservative thinkers of our era, of the modern era, was Russell Kirk. And he wrote this wonderful essay, just 10 short points, called the 10 Rules of Being Conservative, or something like that. And here at TPPF, we have all of our interns and new faculty or new people read it. The reason is, he says, conservatism is not an ideology. It's a way of habit. It's sort of a conduct of behavior. And it starts with living out your obligations, your social obligations in your community. It has nothing to do with who you vote for. And that's sort of the overriding theme to our conversation today, which is that we can care very deeply about what happens in next week's election. We can fight for the outcome we want. We can be advocating for the candidates we like. And in fact, all of that's important. I encourage all of that to occur. But that ought to be true simultaneously, while we also recognize that life goes on after the election. Kirk, for example, would remind us that elections come and go. Electoral candidates come and go. You know that from your own service on the Austin City Council. And what's more important to you is, of course, your business, raising your kids, being a wife. Same thing for me. I'm very invested in Election Day and all of the ideas, especially, that have gone into that and that will flow from that. But ultimately, the much bigger obligation that I have is to make sure that when I go home, I'm being present to my family, but also to my neighbors. And it ought to be the case that if we have a neighbor in need, regardless of our political differences, that because he or she is our neighbor, we're the first person there we want to help. Mm-hmm. That used to be the case in the United States, but we've become increasingly hostile to one another. Mm-hmm. And I'm just hopeful, because I know a lot of good people on both sides, that we're going to be able to get past this election. We're going to be able to get past the consequences of COVID. And we're going to be able to return to a time in America when we get along. And one of the reasons that we would do so is because we have a renewed sense of pride in this country, something that I think is dramatically lacking.
And I think that it's a good time to be reminded of that as we're kind of going into the holiday season, as you know, the traditions and the family time, and even the football, the Friday night football games of your local high school. It's, when you're interacting with people in person, you are more likely to see that they are of the same kind, right? Regardless of your political beliefs. They have their own personal struggles. They have and they're different from the keyboard warriors that we often see on social media. And I think that has kind of never been more clear as people who have seen the social dilemma and really understand the way that social media is impacting our brains and literally giving different news to different people based on your interaction. And you start to think that that's the way of the world and everybody else must be wrong. But then when you go sit next to your neighbor or your friend or whatever it might be at the Friday night football game, or when you see them walking in your neighborhood, that's when you really see the importance of those ties. And as I'm going into the holiday season, I'm kind of trying to think about, obviously there's challenges due to COVID, but what can we be doing as a family to be showing our friends and neighbors that we love them and care about them and want to be there for them no matter what. It's little things like the Halloween booing that's going on. I don't know if you know about that, but little gift, bring a little gift to two of your neighbors and surprise them, leave it on their doorstep and ask them to pass it on to other people. We make cupcakes for Jesus's birthday on Christmas, which is great, but can we take those cupcakes and then drop them off at the local police station and thank our first responders for working on and being away from their families over the holidays, and kind of what things can I be doing to instill in my children that no matter what is going on around them in the world of politics, that is ultimately most important. So I really appreciate that reminder. I guess I want to ask now, going back to the setup of the country. I mean, is this something that you feel like the founding fathers understood? I mean, as we've talked about, they lived in a divisive time as well. I mean, for goodness sake, they were creating their own country, right? And then that couldn't have been easy. And how did that play into their mentality as they were drafting the Constitution and coming up with a system that was designed to withstand the test of time and be responsive to the people, kind of no matter what the mentality of the mob is going on around them. It seems like we live in a world where we're just pivoting from one crisis to the next. And, one day we're supposed to be posting this on social media to signify this. And the next, you can't say this anymore because that makes somebody else mad. And it's like, I feel like our founding fathers knew that is not a way to sustainably run a country. So how do you feel like that played into the drafting of our Constitution?
Well, significantly. In fact, you might say that what the founders succeeded in doing was building a system that could overcome the very limited nature of human nature, and in ways that you and I might put it, the fallen nature of men and women. And so they understood that from their understanding of history, from previous countries, I was about to say previous republics. There was just one for a short time, and that's in Rome, but also their reading of philosophy, especially Montesquieu. And what they desired to do, and I would say they succeeded in doing, was building a system that, of course, took power rather, and diffused it. And so we might understand that from the standpoint of the three branches of government: the executive, the judicial, and the legislative. Three branches, by the way, we're going to get to know well as we watch the news in November. We might also understand the different levels of government: federal, state, local. And we also understand that in each state, there is the opportunity to pass laws, probably over 95% of public policy at the state level, that may or may not become federal law, depending upon how popular it becomes. The point is, what they were trying to do was to offset human nature with a system that allowed people to have different ideas. And so when it came to elections, they built a system that is very clear. I mean, the requirements of the law, of the Constitution, could not be clearer. And I understand that if for whatever reason the election has to go to the US Supreme Court on today, which I'd celebrate as soon to be Justice Amy Coney Barrett Day, on Hillary Clinton's birthday. I mean, I've already been joking with left of center friends that there's just some cosmic justice there. We ought to be able to laugh about that is the point. But because it's just funny. We can't joke anymore, but to get off that.
You have left of center friends? You have left of
I
center
do.
friends?
It surprises a lot of people, but remember, I went to the University of Texas and studied the liberal arts. So, and very proudly keep those friends. I'm not sure they would say the same about me, but they know what I do for a living. The point is that, as de Tocqueville said, a generation after the Constitution was ratified, if Americans ever complain about their country, it's not because they have an imperfect system. It's because they themselves are imperfect, just like every other human on the planet. And I think we often lose sight of that. And so just to tie this up to the wonderful comment you made about the seemingly little things we can do at Halloween or Christmas, it all boils down to belonging. And right now, because fewer and fewer Americans are belonging to a church, fewer and fewer Americans are belonging to the Kiwanis Club or the Rotary Club, one of the tribes we belong to is our political party. It used to be that we belonged to a lot of tribes. And so one of the things that I try to do in my neighborhood is stir up some fun. It's a little bit of trouble, but some fun among everyone's school. You know, so on Saturday, being a proud Longhorn, my next door neighbor, who's a Baylor alum, might have known that the Longhorns won the game. Had the situation been reversed as it was last year, then obviously he had opportunity to pick on me. The point seems silly, Ellen, but it's true. To the extent that we can really identify those other belongings we have, churches, our alma maters, hopefully joining the Kiwanis and Rotary clubs again, it really does help to offset the extent to which our party membership is such a vital part of our identification. I think it's great, by the way, that people are active in the Democrat Party and active in the Republican Party and the minor parties. What I don't think is great is that we also are not active in other groups. And if we can get back to doing that in the United States, then I think we can, to the heart of your question, do what our founders did and most generations in this country did, which is belong to a number of groups that help to identify us beyond just our partisan leanings.
That's such a good point. I mean, it really is that sense of belonging is really what people want, regardless of their political leanings or anything. And as we've had fewer and fewer institutions or organizations that people identify with, it has heightened kind of the importance of their allegiance to their party and probably contributed to the divisiveness. That's a good segue into my next question, but I want to make sure that our audience knows that you guys can ask questions as well. We'll spend maybe another 10 or 15 minutes talking just Kevin and I, but I would love to know what questions you have for Kevin. So please feel free to drop your questions into the comment section and we'll get to those here in just a couple of minutes. I also love what you said about not being perfect, because again, in this year where we've seen so much unrest, I would say specifically to this question, in the sense of criminal justice and police reform, and I think had a lot of people questioning America, you know, and questioning the roots of America and how we came to be and how we kind of make up for the sins of our past. And one thing that had occurred to me during that time was kind of exactly what you said, is America is not perfect because none of us are perfect, right? If we were perfect people, then we would have a perfect country. But the reality is there is no perfect country in the entire world. And the thing that makes America great, from my perspective, is that we are always striving to be better. We are always looking for that innovation. We are always looking for how to improve ourselves and each other. And it's that kind of drive to continually be better within the existing framework that has served us so well, that really sets America up for success and sets us up individually to prosper and thrive, and continually pursue the freedom that we all want. And, you know, I think you're writing a book about this, actually, why America. And when I hear people talk about, my mom was born in Venezuela, so it's somewhat personal to me when I hear people talk about, that, well, we should go to a socialist system, or this would never happen in a socialist country. I mean, it's just not true. And all you have to do is look to socialist countries to see how much more oppressed everyone is, regardless of race, where we want to be a race to the top, not a race to the bottom. So tell us about your book and that project, and kind of what you see from your perspective as a historian and as an author of why America.
Well, thanks for that question, Ellen. Just your question is a lot of food for thought for our audience, so I appreciate it. The book that I'm writing is entitled Why America, How a Revitalized Patriotism Will Be the Future of America. And what I am driving at, as you can tell from the title, is that something has happened to patriotism. It's declined, it's deteriorated. In fact, a couple of things. The first is we know from 4 or 5 different surveys, even before 2020, that the percentage of Americans who say that they are proud of being an American has declined precipitously. And of course, that decline has been most pronounced among so-called millennials. And before COVID started, I made sure that I went around Texas and a couple of other places and talked to them about patriotism. And it wasn't, the old white bald guy wagging his finger saying you need to be patriotic. It was really listening and trying to understand what it was that caused their lack of faith in America that I happen not to have experienced. I just grew up at a time when, even though America was imperfect, because it's always been imperfect, I loved it and continue to. And what it came back to was education, or a lack thereof, about the founding generation, about the heroism of people who saved the country in the Civil War or World War I. And what history has devolved into is a bunch of competing narratives according to identity groups. Mm-hmm. And of course, the human persons who compose those groups are very important, every single one of them. But the point is that America is greater than any one of us or any one of our groups, regardless of who we are. And that's really the story and the promise of America. And so 2020, in addition to COVID and the government shutdowns, has been extremely frustrating for many of us, because we see arguments about legitimate questions, whether they be justice or race, or for that matter, defunding the police. I might say that's illegitimate, but at least it's a legitimate question about police behavior, turn into anti-American screeds. I experienced that myself when I was leaving the White House a few weeks ago. And I'm just wondering, what is it that at the root of these people hates this country? Because I think that every single one of us ought to be grateful that we wake up in a place that, while imperfect in its history, was and remains, this is literally true, Ellen, the only country that had slavery that on its own accord ended it. Now, we shouldn't celebrate that we had slavery, but there's no one celebrating that we had slavery in the United States. We ought to be celebrating, going back to our conversation about the founders, that they had the wisdom. George Washington himself, one of the largest slave owners in the country, had the wisdom to set forth a system in which, decades down the road, slavery could be ended. We ought to lament that slavery existed and that it took that long to free the 4 million slaves who were enslaved. And yet we ought to celebrate, as ex-slaves themselves did from the 1860s to the 1960s, that they woke up in America. And I think that we are, even though we've endured a lot of ugliness in 2020, I happen to think we have pierced through a lot of that lack of education. And the optimist in me tells me that we have tremendous opportunities at the K through 12 and college level to teach the true story of America, which is not some kind of whitewashing. It's merely telling the truth. And the truth ought to be so beautiful and so inspiring that every single one of us wants to wake up and, to go back to my point about belonging, belong to the group called Americans. That ought to be the first thing that unites every single one of the 330 million people who were fortunate enough to wake up here this morning.
Love it. I love it. Yeah, I mean, so I love the optimistic tone, and it seems like it's true practically too, because you hear kind of from both sides, but I feel like mostly from the left that if so and so is elected president, if the president from the other side is elected, that they're going to move, right? They're going to leave the country. They're done. But then the president gets elected, and a couple of years later, they're still here, right? It never. I mean, it's funny that history repeats itself. It's such a common phrase for people to say, if this president gets elected, then we're moving to a different country. But the fact that they're still here, I think, proves that America is bigger than just who's at the top of the ticket. And that leads me actually to one of our audience questions. Is we're always talking about the media is so dominated with the president, and we're almost infatuated just as humans with the presidency, right? I mean, the amount of news coverage that is focused on the presidential election pales in comparison to city council elections or county commissioner elections or even state legislative elections. Yet there is so much on the ballot. Anybody who has gone to vote, and if you haven't, just a reminder that this is the last week of early voting and you should get to the polls. But it pales in comparison to the coverage of local issues. So what should we be looking to understand about America other than who's at the top of the ticket?
Well, I will answer that directly, but also sort of take an opportunity to explain something you mentioned. And that is, I think it's true that the executive branch in the United States has gotten too powerful. That's if you're looking to assign blame, then assign blame to both political parties. Just to generalize a little bit, Democrat presidents since the New Deal have grown government too large for domestic programs, and Republican presidents have grown government too large when it comes to foreign policy and the military. Some of those programs, some of those military exploits we like, but frankly, until the current president, we've not had a Republican president since World War II actually attempt to put those in balance. Not an endorsement, just saying historically, it's fascinating, regardless of whether President Trump ends up being just a one-term president or becomes a two-term president. But the point is that regardless of who is occupying the White House, we have all of these other levels of government at the state and local levels. And let's say that someone's tuning in and they're a supporter of Joe Biden. If President Trump wins re-election, I can almost guarantee you that the Democrats are still going to control the House, and they've got a fighting chance, of course, at controlling the Senate. So even at the federal level, government is divided. That ought to make them optimistic. If they are that optimistic and convinced by their way of thinking, then why would you claim that you're going to leave the country? If the candidates that I'm supporting happen not to win next week, I can tell you there's a 0% chance that I and my family are leaving. Why? Because this is the greatest country in the history of the world. And if I believe in the eternal truths surrounding my political agenda, then I want to stay here. And certainly at TPPF, from a policy point of view, we're going to stay here and see that through. In short, Ellen, we put way too much emphasis on elected men and elected women, and not enough emphasis on what we do in our lives. It goes back to the excellent points you made about the little habits that y'all have in your neighborhood. And they're habits that we all ought to try after Election Day. It might actually be a wonderful opportunity of national healing from 2020. And we ought to craft that in a way that's truly nonpartisan. I think it's really important when we get past this election season that we spend less time turning on, whatever TV shows we like, whatever our favorite network is, and instead focus on the human relationships that make us American. Whether we're Republican or Democrat doesn't make us American. We ought to have such gratitude for waking up here each day that we ought to be really joyful when we see our neighbor and tell them hello in the morning or good evening when we get home from work. We've got to get back to those simple behaviors to really diminish how much faith we have in elected men and women, and also how much faith that we have in a media that's trying to drive our opinion one way or the other.
Mm-hmm. And as far as non-political institutions that maybe people can look to join, maybe they will be renewed after this election season to say, you know what, I do want to do something for my community, and I want to do something more than just make sure I meet my neighbors. So one of our viewers wants to know, what are our examples of community institutions that aren't political that they can join as Americans?
Excellent question. I would say, and even for people who are somehow offended by religiosity, we know from American history the most important institution to join would be a church. Doesn't matter to me which church, although I guess it might, but for the sake of the debate, just being silly, join a church. If church isn't your thing, then the next most important, just looking at data, answering this as an academic, would be organizations like the Kiwanis Club and the Rotary Club, both of which have seen precipitous declines in membership in the last 20 years. That's devastating. If a member of the audience has ever been a member of either of those clubs, and I have, you know that they truly are nonpartisan. They truly are composed of people from both sides. They're what sociologists and historians call mediating institutions. They mediate our human passions, to be a Republican or a Democrat. And in fact, that's precisely what our founders were trying to do with government, was to make it a mediating institution of human behavior, human relationships. And so all of those, as I like to say, are upstream from politics. The last thing I would say is a comment about social media. Another belonging that many of us have is to Facebook groups or to nextdoor.com. And if you are, so for example, where I live in a little town in the hill country, there are a couple of Facebook groups. There isn't a Nextdoor account, but I belong to another one. And we all know that right now, there's a lot of political speech going on, a lot of partisan speech going on in those. How about what you do if the Kiwanis and Rotary Club isn't your thing, that you initiate a thread on Nextdoor or on one of those Facebook groups saying, let's just get together, have some cookies. In Texas, let's have a barbecue. Let's drink some Dr. Pepper or some beer. And the rule is going to be no politics. But then you need to suggest to people what they talk about. And so it comes back to making sure that in our own consumption of news, that we're reading things that are upstream from politics, which basically that would be our entire lives, society and culture.
Mm-hmm. Well, I love the suggestions that you made. And I also feel like I've been able to find that sense of belonging and fulfillment through nonprofit charity work as well. And, while I'm still trying to figure out where I belong and where I can make the biggest impact, I will tell you that I recently joined the board of the Austin Monitor, which covers local city council and county commissioners. And, media is something that we talk about all the time, having such an impact on how we consume our news and what kind of information that we're consuming. And I have to say, as somebody who was covered by the Austin Monitor, in depth while I was serving, it maybe wasn't the first organization that I jumped at the chance to be a part of, but I also understood that having good local media is so critical to a functioning democracy. And I felt like I had a unique perspective to provide to that organization. So whether it's something like that, or Friends of the Children, or Big Brothers Big Sisters, like there's all of these other organizations in Austin that might provide that fulfillment for you. And sometimes there are organizations that are really big and you feel like, okay, I'll give my donation here, or I'll sign up to volunteer here, but I don't feel like I'm really making a difference just because the organization is so big. And so I want to encourage people too, that you can make a difference just on your own. I mean, I'm telling you, one of the things that I am most proud of all my public service is just recently, during COVID, the schools were closed, and I worried about the working families in Austin and how kids of at-risk children, either from single parent households or even two-parent households where both of their parents had to go to work and didn't have the capacity to stay home with their children, how that was going to affect the education for the kids who were being left behind. And so I went and talked to my church about it and said, we have this facility, it's underutilized during the week. I want you guys to consider opening your doors and doing a virtual learning pod where we invite children from the community to come and do their virtual learning, and we'll hire people to oversee it. And kudos to them for saying, yeah, we're willing to consider it. And I went out and they said, we need $59,000 to make it happen. And I said, okay, I'm going to call my friends. I'm going to put it on social media. And we did. We raised, we raised the money. We hired former teachers to kind of oversee the program. And it was 25 kids. So is it, the most impactful thing I've ever done for the community? Maybe not, but for those 25 kids, maybe it is, for those 25 kids who may have been dropping out of school. Otherwise, I hopefully I had a small part in changing their lives. So, and that was incredibly rewarding and fulfilling to me. So I'm always encouraging. I just feel like sometimes we feel like we're just one tiny cog, in this giant system. And does my vote for president really matter? Well, I won my city council race by 59 votes. So yeah, your vote really mattered in that local city council election. And hopefully, my idea that I brought to my church really mattered for those 25 kids who were able to be served by that community. And so it's not always that, well, I'm just one person and what difference can I make? You're just one person and you can make a huge difference for your family, your friends, and your neighbors. And I'll give one other plug to the Policy Circle, which is another, it's a nonpartisan way to get your friends together and kind of like a book club to say, and instead of reading a book, you read a policy brief, and it's not social issues, it's economic issues. And you can get together over a glass of coffee or a glass of wine and talk about something that's going on in your community. And what they have found is that through kind of removing the stress and the divisiveness of those conversations and getting together again in person in these small groups, it gives people more confidence to be more civically engaged in whatever avenue is fulfilling to them. So there are things out there, and of course, I'm sure you can reach out to Kevin or I directly if you want more ideas. But so those are the things that I would suggest. But Kevin, so going back to the election, just because that's what's looming, right? A week away. As we approach this, so many of us are feeling, I don't know, I for one am ready to have it over with. So maybe I'll be happy on after election day, regardless of what the outcome is. But what are kind of your final thoughts as we're wrapping up our hour together on allowing us to keep perspective on not overemphasizing the significance of one single race, one single outcome of one presidential election? How do we kind of keep that in perspective and approach, the day after? And why is it important for us to do that?
Sure. Thanks, Ellen. I'd say as soon as you're done watching this live stream, you, the audience, that to Ellen's question, if you're in that category of having had enough election news, enough 2020 news, then take one of these tips that Ellen or I have offered. Kiwanis Club, Rotary Club, the truly excellent list that Ellen has given you. I'd add to that. I've done this in a couple of places. Your town, your city, your county also all have volunteer boards and commissions. Almost always there are vacancies there, and they're nonpartisan by nature. You're going to encounter people who have a different worldview than you do, but that's sort of the point here. But you get to do things that are really important because they affect your daily life in the town and county you live. The point is, as soon as you're done watching this, go pledge to yourself, I'm going to go do one of those things and do it. Because I actually see that we have a tremendous opportunity 9 days from now. 9 days from now would be the day after the election. And that opportunity is to convert what's going to be a record turnout. I think that this is going to be, at least in terms of numbers of voters, record turnout, probably not in percentage terms, but close. We have an opportunity to convert all of those people into people who care, into people who have been yearning for a sense of belonging. Now, I happen to think, because of my faith in God and faith in this country, that there has to be some silver lining to what we've all endured in 2020.
Right.
And regardless of our political position, we ought to want to have a brighter future for this country. And so we need to figure out how we can invite at least one person. Maybe it's a neighbor, maybe it's someone you talk to in line at the voting location, maybe it's someone at the grocery store, to whatever we've decided to do. And whether that's a local board or commission, a Rotary Club, one of the many nonprofits Ellen mentioned here in the Austin area, every place has a healthy menu from which to choose. Invite someone to join you. That's the kind of thing that ought to make us more optimistic about election night. Because what it's going to do is give us something to look forward to. If our guy doesn't win, we're going to have a sense of dread and a sense of unbelonging to the country, to the county, to the city, whatever the race is that we care deeply about. And that's a heck of a way to go through life. In fact, we've seen that, unfortunately, as a result of COVID and the isolation that's come from the shutdown. So now is the time as Americans to use the technology we have available to us to convert those people into folks who aren't apathetic, which is the greatest illness that has been facing us, but into people who care about the future.
Yeah, I love that. And we would be remiss if, well, at least I would, by not, recommending the Texas Public Policy Foundation. And for me, the Liberty Leadership Council, a group of young professionals who are interested in learning more about policy. That has been just a wonderful group for me. I've really enjoyed getting to know people through that. And of course, we have the Texas legislative session coming up in January. So definitely go get involved in the civic groups and your neighbors and the civic engagement that we've been talking about. But also, I think I'm hopeful. I'm really optimistic that good things are going to come out of this legislative session that begins in January. So if anybody is interested in learning more about how to get engaged with the Liberty Leadership Council or with TPPF, of course, we would be happy to talk to you about that. And quick plug to just think about running for office. You don't have to run for president. You don't have to run for Congress, but we need good leaders to step up and run for office. Especially our city council and our county commissioner seats and those local seats, that our school board that truly has an impact on our daily lives. You don't have to have any special qualifications, or you don't have to be independently wealthy. All we need is good people who really care. And so if you're frustrated by the direction of our political climate, one way for you to change it is to decide, well, I may be willing to do a true public service by putting myself on the ballot. So that's something to think about. And of course, I've written a whole book about it called Step Up, How to Advocate Like a Woman, that people can get on Amazon or wherever books are sold. But of course, I'm always interested in getting more conservative leaders to kind of answer that call. And I look forward to reading your book, Kevin, Why America, when it comes out. So please keep us posted on that. And in the meantime, can people connect with you on social media? Is at Texas Policy the best way to find you?
Yes, at Texas Policy, also at Kevin Roberts TX, can find me there. And I'll just say thank you, Ellen, for this wonderful conversation. Before I pitch it back to you, just leave our audience with a quick thought. I was rereading President Reagan's farewell address from 1989, because Reagan did such a good job across the political aisle of revitalizing patriotism. And in that farewell address 31 years ago, he said, almost 32, he said, look, we've succeeded. We, not just I, we have succeeded in revitalizing patriotism, but what we have not yet done is reinstitutionalize it. And I think that's exactly what you've been trying to get at in this conversation, which is that we have a lot of opportunities in front of us to help us understand, to put into perspective, even a very contentious election. But the time to do that starts today, so that when the election comes and goes, that we can get about the business of being Americans.
Well, thank you, Kevin, so much for that. You are just such a wonderful leader of TPPF, and it's always wonderful to hear your perspective. I personally am so grateful for the Texas Public Policy Foundation and all of the opportunities that you have provided me, but more importantly, the work that you do on behalf of my family and my neighbors every day as, as the largest state think tank that is supporting liberty and freedom and really moving the needle when it comes to enacting effective public policy at the state level. So thank you for all that you do and for all of the wisdom that you shared with us today. And if anybody wants to connect with me after this, you can find me online at Ellen Troxclair or through the Texas Public Policy website, texaspolicy.com. So thank you all for joining us for this optimistic conversation. We are going to be okay, regardless of what happens next Tuesday. And we look forward to connecting with you soon after that.